Hi, welcome to our webinar on ethical storytelling. I'm Amy Costello, and I'm so glad to have you here. Before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsor, Esri. Esri is the leader in interactive mapping and spatial analytics software, and nonprofits use Esri tools to tell the stories of their communities with interactive maps and multimedia that are highly engaging and provide you with visual language that's easy for your audience to understand. I'm Amy Costello, and I want to also thank now all the women who have spoken with us over the past couple of years, who will speak about today, and they have taught us so much about being better, more ethical storytellers. And this presentation is a humble and imperfect form of thanks and appreciation for all that each of you have taught me. And we will get started now. My name is Amy Costello. I'm the host and founder of Tiny Spark, a podcast that investigates nonprofits, international aid, and philanthropy. I was a correspondent in Africa for 5 years and worked as a producer at NPR in Washington prior to that. And I'm so happy to have here my esteemed colleague, Freddie Boswell, senior producer for Tiny Spark. And Freddie, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hi, I'm Freddie Boswell. I started my career at the BBC World Service, mainly in African news and current affairs, and then moved to Washington, D.C., where I was with NPR, and I've been with Tiny Spark for producing for 4 years now.
Thank you. So this is going to be kind of a brief 1-hour presentation on ethical storytelling aimed at many of you who are nonprofit and philanthropic professionals. If you're on social media, we'd love for you to be using the hashtag TinySparkTalks to kind of share what you're learning today and join a community of other like-minded people. And we invite you to leave your questions here too in the chat. Freddie and will be moderating your questions, and we plan to have time at the end of this presentation to have a little back and forth and Q&A with all of you. We'd love to hear your questions and comments about what you hear today. We'll do our best to answer them. And we're hoping that this is going to be the first of many conversations we might have about ethical storytelling, and really see this as a launching off point to talk more deeply about these really important issues. So we're going to try to cover just a few things today. We are going to be playing some audio from our podcast. So if you do have headphones handy and you don't have them on right now, we'd encourage you to try to grab a pair of headphones, because we're going to be listening to the voices of some of the women we've interviewed over the past couple of years. And I think your experience will be more enhanced if you do have a pair of headphones. So basically today, we're going to just do kind of a behind the scenes look at the work we do here, interviewing many people who have experienced trauma. And we're going to talk to you about how we try to report their stories and interview them, guided by the principles of ethics and respect. And in sharing our techniques with you, we hope you're going to come away with some lessons that you can apply to your own work as storytellers of one kind or another. And I want to start today by playing a piece of our interview with Kenyan Sophie Otiende. She works with women and girls who have been trafficked. And she had many critiques for us about the way that survivors of trauma are exploited by nonprofits. And if you're a nonprofit that has helped someone, and then you ask that person to kind of share their story with your audience, maybe for fundraising purposes, maybe to highlight a social cause that you champion, well, Sophie finds that very interaction highly problematic. She says that too often nonprofits parade and exploit those they have helped. And one thing that Sophie talked to us about is this issue of consent. If a person agrees to be interviewed by you, and they say that, yes, you may share my story, what are the power dynamics at play?
Because if you think about most of the people actually requiring victims to tell their stories are organizations that have assisted them. Think about the power dynamic. Think about the fact that this is probably the organization that basically stopped something horrible from happening from them. Think about the power that that organization holds over this victim. And then think about consent. Think about whether that victim, that survivor, would actually be able to give proper consent about telling their stories or about being involved.
And those points that Sophie is making bring me to talk about the dignity of those we interview, especially when they are survivors of trauma, and we are asking them to share their story with us. Yes, we must be aware of the power dynamics, and then we have to think about how we define those people we interview, how we might be inclined to label them, and whether that's our job or even our right to label those we profile. And not everyone wants to be called a survivor, for instance. They are so much more than that. And if we do choose labels, we risk doing a story about somebody that can tend to be very one-dimensional. By labeling people like survivor or formerly homeless person or recovering addict, the list goes on and on of the ways that we like to kind of encapsulate a person. But I don't think any of those labels are useful or ethical. And so before we even sit down with someone to interview them, and we're aware of their delicate, sometimes painful histories, we give thought to who they are beyond their traumas. We know about their victories, their passions, who they were before trauma, and we are interested in the whole person. And Sophie Otiende is a perfect example of that. Freddie, I'm hoping that you can share just a little bit about how you came across Sophie and what you learned in the process about researching her.
Absolutely. When I joined Tiny Spark, I wanted to make sure that we regularly featured voices from the Global South. I'd come from NPR, where I found that they were wary of broadcasting accents unfamiliar to an American ear. And it occurred to me that Sophie might not have made it to air at NPR because of her accent. But anyway, for us, as soon as I read about her, I knew I wanted her on the podcast. She was just this cool Kenyan woman who I felt people just needed to hear from. In one of the first articles I found, I learned that Sophie herself had been trafficked when she was a teenager. And I also read that she didn't like to be labeled as a survivor. So Amy, you and I discussed this. And when it came time for the interview, we made a decision not to focus on the fact that Amy was a victim of trafficking. About 45 minutes into the interview, you finally asked Sophie if she wanted to speak about her own personal experience. And when I listened to her response, I began to really question why had I wanted to interview her so much? Was it because she was a survivor? And did I initially think that that was the most interesting thing about her? But she had so much more to offer and teach us in that interview. So I want you all to listen to Sophie describe why she is reluctant to talk about her own experience being trafficked.
My problem, my conflict with sharing my story is the way I'm a very blunt person. I call it survivor porn. People have this obsession with listening to these horrific stories over and over again without really concretely questioning the need to actually have that reference. And we've kind of romanticized it to the point that you almost wonder whether people understand this is a really, really bad thing, because it's like, oh, we'll have a survivor share their story. The fact that we require a human element for us to empathize basically means that our level of empathy is so low that we need to go through this to come and tell us it's bad so that we can be able to empathize.
And looking back now, I note that in the web story about Sophie's episode, we don't mention that she's a survivor, and we didn't need to. Her words about the topic were strong enough to stand on their own. They didn't require the hook of her personal story.
And, inevitably, we will share stories of people who have endured trauma, as we often do on Tiny Spark. And I see that one of you has asked if we're going to talk about other people who haven't experienced trauma. And yes, we are. So we will be getting to a wide range of experiences in this presentation today. But because so many of you work in the nonprofit sector, inherently, we often are working with populations that have experienced trauma or hardship of one kind or another. And so that's kind of why we're focusing right now on people who have experienced trauma of one kind or another, and how we might interact with them appropriately and tell their stories in a way that's ethical and sound. So, we do kind of explicitly sometimes talk to people about their trauma. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how we approach in interviews this delicate issue of asking people about their trauma. And above all, we ask ourselves, why are we doing this? For what purpose? And these are the kinds of questions that Freddie and I always get clarity on before we ever embark on an interview. Why are we telling this person's story? Why are we speaking to this person in particular? And Freddie and I had discussions about this recently when we decided to do a follow-up story on some coverage we did a couple of years ago about the Me Too movement in the international aid and development sector. We did a comprehensive series with PRI's The World, talking to many women who were field workers for international organizations who had been sexually abused and assaulted while on the job. And we also uncovered the kind of egregious response of the nonprofits that they worked for in the wake of their assaults and how they were treated so badly by the humanitarian organizations they worked for. And so we wanted to do just a follow-up story now a couple of years on, and we interviewed a woman named Tanya Culver Humphrey. And a year prior, Tanya had gone public with her story about the fact that her father, a celebrated global humanitarian who co-founded the organization Mercy Corps, had been sexually assaulting Tanya since childhood. Tanya had tried to tell many people about her father's abuse, but no one believed her. So she went to the Oregonian, a paper in her hometown of Portland, where Mercy Corps is also headquartered. And the paper did a 10-month investigation and published an accompanying documentary. And so I want to share some things that Freddie and I discuss and consider when we're thinking about doing a story as sensitive as this one. We will not be getting into the details of abuse, so that's, if there's any concerns as we move forward with this conversation, we are not going to be talking about the details of the abuse at all. I also want you to know that I've been in touch with Tanya this week, and I let her know that we were planning to talk about her story in the way that we're about to, and Tanya has given us permission to do that. And I think this is a really important part of ethical storytelling, allowing those who have experienced trauma to be true partners in the storytelling, to keep them in the loop as a story develops, to be extra sure that the details we are sharing with them about their very personal lives are okay with them. I would never want to surprise someone like Tanya with anything public without her express permission. So having been given Tanya's permission to do so, Freddie and I are going to talk a little bit about how we went about this interview. First, I had watched the documentary of Tanya that the Oregonian had produced, and I expressed my concerns to Freddie after watching that documentary about how incredibly upset, and I would just say even fragile, that Tanya appeared to me in that documentary. And I was really concerned about not wanting to re-traumatize her in my interview. And so I shared these concerns with Freddie. And Freddie, what do you recall from these conversations?
Well, I didn't agree with you because I'd been following Tanya on Twitter, checking out her interviews, and we'd emailed a couple of times. So I remember I told you that the sense I got was of a woman who wanted to speak and who was ready to speak out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a thing I appreciate about having a producer like Freddie, is that we will often have these discussions and, kind of share our concerns. And it's just really helpful to have somebody to kind of bounce these ideas off of. And so I also respect Freddie's judgment so much. In fact, all the voices you're going to be hearing from today are people that Freddie really, for the most part, kind of identified and found for our podcast. And so we had this kind of conversation, and we're trying to get clarity about why are we doing this interview? And this is really important for everyone to think about. If you're going to just tell a victim's story without any context or kind of higher purpose, you risk producing a story that frankly can be called trauma porn. But if you can put someone's story into a larger context, it can help to bring to life issues that we need to focus on and fix. And so we decided that telling Tanya's story would be an effective way to talk about sexual perpetrators and how they can hide in the international aid sector, and likely in the same ways they can hide here in the US nonprofit sector. When we have been doing our early reporting about Me Too in the humanitarian aid space, this is one thing that we uncovered, was that there are serial sexual perpetrators in the international aid space because they can hide. They're seen as kind of good people, kind of beyond reproach. And so it's for a number of reasons that I won't get into today. This was an issue we had flagged. And so 2 years later, we wanted to revisit it because Tanya's father was a sexual perpetrator who got away with egregious crimes against his daughter for years and years and years. And so we wanted to figure out why. The other thing, again, putting a personal story into a larger important context, the other thing that we explored by telling Tanya's story is about something called institutional courage and institutional betrayal, and how so many of the women that we had interviewed prior and in interviewing Tanya, we saw examples of institutional betrayal, that these women in the wake of their assaults were betrayed by the organizations they worked for. And in the end, Mercy Corps, who her father had founded, in the end, ultimately displayed institutional courage by embracing Tanya after she came forward with her story. So I just want you to get a sense of like, we're going to interview this woman, but we really need to figure out why and what kind of context are we going to put her in. And that makes Tanya's story all the more important. And it makes us help to really kind of feel why telling a story like this is important and why it happened. How could it have been avoided? Why was this guy allowed to continue his abuse? So these are all big, important, universal questions that we're trying to answer. So we decided to move ahead with this interview with Tanya. And we're going to hear a piece from her now, but I just want to kind of, in setting this up, talk to you about how I prepare for interviews a little bit. And I think that many of you, if you are if you generally tend to interview a lot of people, or maybe you're interviewed yourself, the way that many people do it is they kind of come up with a pre-written list of questions and they kind of just go through it one by one by one. And I'm not convinced that this is the right approach, especially when interviewing somebody who has experienced trauma. My goal in an interview with somebody like Tanya is to establish intimacy and trust. So I am fully present with her. And the most important thing that I think that I can do in an interview is ask follow-up questions, questions that are not on my list, questions that I can only ask if I'm truly listening to her and everything she's telling me. So with Tanya, I started off my interview as I do all my interviews. I simply asked her to introduce herself to me. And I invite you to listen now very carefully to Tanya's response. How does she strike you in terms of how she's doing speaking to me? And also note later, I ask her a follow-up question based on something she says to me. And this is what I do in interviews: listen intently and ask follow-up questions.
Well, I'd like to just start by having you introduce yourself to me, please.
My name's Tanya Culver Humphrey. I'm happy to be here. I don't know what else to say.
Okay. And are you an artist?
Yeah, I'm an art teacher. I'm a mom. I'm on a whole new journey right now of being free with my story. So I guess that's where the I don't know what to say comes in.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're going to...
defining who I am now.
Yeah. Do you want to talk to me a little bit about that? Like, what have you been experiencing since the story came out in the Oregonian? Like, just when you think about yourself and like, I don't want, we'll have time to talk about the external people, but like kind of inside yourself. Can you talk to me a little bit about kind of the transformation or changes that you've been undergoing since the story came out, in whatever way you're comfortable doing so?
So note that Tanya tells me she is defining who she is now. And I ask her about that. I'm curious. How does she see herself? I'm not interested in labeling Tanya, putting her in some kind of box. I want to always delve into complexity and veer away from simple labels and storylines. And what you'll notice here is I'm also very early in our conversation giving Tanya agency and control, which is so important to people who have experienced trauma. I'm not driving this interview. She is leading me in many ways, and I'm merely there to hold whatever it is she says to me. My job is to make Tanya feel safe and respected with a story that is hers. It is not mine. And I have interviewed countless sexual assault survivors and approached each of them with the same level of humility and curiosity. And so I spent the next few minutes with Tanya asking more about what the last year had been like for her since her story had come out in the Oregonian, and what it was like for her to be the center of a really explosive story. And I'm going to play another piece of tape now, which is about 10 minutes into our interview. And you'll see that I ask her how she's doing with our conversation, getting her consent that she is comfortable to continue. And Tanya then also tells me how much she appreciates the questions I'm asking her. So here, Tanya is going to talk about the fact that she had to hide this huge secret that she had to keep as a child as her father was abusing her. And she explains why saying her own name to me, why just saying her name in the documentary was such a huge moment for her. We're listening here to someone reflect on what it's like to be the center of a story.
I felt like I was the part to be hidden, you know. I was the part of the Culver family to be hidden, because I was. You know, no, it was like the elephant in the room and all this stuff. Nobody wanted to really acknowledge me. And so that made it scary, and owning it, saying this is my name. This is who I am, all of me. I am Tanya Culver Humphrey. I am not going to run away from who I am. Now, then, in the future, this is it. That was a scary moment of declaration for me, saying that on there, like that.
I can only imagine, Tanya. How are you feeling right now? Like, in terms of how are we doing together right now?
Good. Yeah, it's good.
Okay.
I appreciate these questions. I haven't been asked those in particular like that, and it's something. I think it's really important to me. So I appreciate you asking them there. It really was an important part of this whole process that I don't think people even understand when they watch the documentary. You see the beginning of the documentary and then you see the end. And I don't know if people understand the process of what that was like to go through, and how hard it was at the beginning, and how at the end I could say the things that I said. It was monumental.
Absolutely.
So, a note here about the questions that we ask people when interviewing them for a story. And I think, this can be a big stumbling block for people in interviewing. We often are afraid to ask certain questions. And to me, it's really so much about our demeanor, our humility, our curiosity, our respect for people. And I think when you demonstrate all those things in an authentic way to somebody you're interviewing, it's amazing what they are willing to tell you. One of my kind of favorite things, frankly, about being a journalist for the past 20 years is I like to think that I get paid to ask total strangers personal questions. And it is what I love. And it's such a unique opportunity and privilege. And I want to note that in all the years I've been doing this, I have very rarely ever have someone say to me, I don't want to answer that. 9 times out of 10, if not more, people want to speak. They want to be heard. And it's all about the way that you receive what they say and in the way that you ask your questions. So, and I think especially when we're talking about interviewing people who have had difficult things happen to them, it gives a feeling of safety to them. So Freddie, I know you have some thoughts about this, about the close association between journalists and the work they produce. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of share your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think they echo some of what you said. I mean, I didn't study journalism, and so I've learned through just years doing it, speaking to people, and, making mistakes. But I think I've always felt that the key to good journalism is similar to the key to being a good person. As you mentioned, I think you need to show respect, honesty, humility. You need to listen. You need to recognize boundaries, and you need to recognize your own privilege in direct relation to the story you're telling. I feel that my test for when I'm happy with a piece is I ask myself if I would be happy and comfortable sitting next to the person it is about when listening to it. And I'm not saying that to say that we can't criticize or hold people accountable. Of course we can, and we need to, but we also need to make sure that our storytelling is always fair and careful.
Yeah. And especially because there are personal and professional implications when someone shares their story with the public. And it's so important that we, as storytellers of any kind, think about what life might be like for this person after their stories go public. Sophie Otiende has grave concerns about the potential backlash that can occur by sharing someone's story, one's personal traumas. And the concerns she raises here are ones for all of us to think about. Perhaps we think we're doing favors for people by like, hey, I want to tell your story. And, isn't that great? Well, not always. We have to consider the potential downsides and the risks faced by those we interview. And here's Sophie's thoughts on that.
No one talks to survivors about the impact of telling your story, what it does to you, what it ultimately means, because we tend to think that we live in an ideal world. When I tell my story, everyone will be moved with compassion. We all know that that's not true. I've spoken in public about my story, and I've gotten people abuse me. People tell me that I'm used goods. I've gotten so many things. I've gotten attention that is not okay. What are the systems we've put in place to protect survivors once they've told their stories? Or once they've told their stories, we completely forget that they exist and then move on to the next conference, to another survivor telling their story.
Do Sophie's words make you feel uncomfortable? I think they should. She has a very damning critique that I think is highly relevant for this entire sector. And we really need to give a lot more thought to how and why we are telling the survivors' stories. I spoke to one survivor of sexual abuse just this week who we'd interviewed, and she was talking to me about her experience sharing her story with the media. And she told me that looking back, she realizes like how much she didn't know. She didn't know her rights with reporters about what's off the record, what's on the record, that something's on background. And it kind of made me think like maybe we need reporters need to, give a set of Miranda rights to people that we interview to let them know what their rights are. To let them know that they have agency, that they can say no to our questions. And I think, again, this is for journalists, but this is for all of us in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors who ask people to share their stories, that sometimes they come in and they just don't know how to proceed. They've never done this before. And so, they'll just answer all your questions. And so I think there's so much room here to really think about, how do we need to inform people who are sharing their stories with us so that they are informed coming to us? They know they have choices, that they have agency in this process of storytelling. And so, it's just something to think about. Like, can we be having conversations with those we profile about, well, what might life be like for you after your story comes out, after you're profiled on the front cover of our fundraising material? What are the implications back in Kenya or Brazil for that person who's just been featured on the cover of your fundraising materials, telling this harrowing tale, even her triumphs? I think we just can think a little bit ahead about what might life be like for this person after their stories come out. And there's another thing that I kind of want to talk about, which is interviewing experts. So, which is a whole nother kind of thing. And I think many of you may want to bring in experts to kind of give analysis or to talk about the work that you're doing in the field, the causes that you're championing. And on Tiny Spark, we are very interested kind of broadly in interrogating seemingly good ideas. So some of the interviews that I do are a little more hard-nosed than the ones you've been hearing so far today. We ask tough questions of well-intentioned people. And part of the way that we do that is by interviewing experts. And Freddie, I know in your career, you've had some experiences about so-called experts. And I'd love for you to share kind of what you've observed.
Well, I think that there's often a reliance. And again, I'm mainly thinking about my time that I spent on NPR on turning to experts who've published papers or been quoted in the New York Times. But it makes me think, is someone who's lived with homelessness, for example, not just as, if not more of an expert than someone from Harvard? Obviously, both are needed in storytelling, but I think for many of you working within communities, look there. Like that's often where the truth is. You already have your experts very close to you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And so we've had an array of guests, and Freddie has been amazing at trying to find a real breadth of people who we like to think very broadly about as experts, and what does that word even mean? But sometimes we do kind of get your quintessential traditional expert who sits behind a desk, and they are often very well rehearsed, so it can be difficult to kind of get compelling, heartfelt responses from them. And a while back, we did a comprehensive story on the work of the Innocence Project, which is a nonprofit. We focused on the Innocence Project Texas, and they are part of a larger national nonprofit that many of you have probably heard of. They work to get the wrongfully convicted released from prison. But in the course of our research, getting ready to do a story about them, Freddie found a paper written by an indigent defense attorney named Abby Smith. And she had written a paper called In Praise of the Guilty Project. And Abby made the point that it's, obviously vital to defend the wrongly convicted, and she's a big fan of the Innocence Project, but her work is in defending the guilty. And so we were going to I'm going to just play now a brief exchange that I have with this attorney, Abby. But I just want to note two things here. First, by hearing from Abby, who kind of passionately defends the importance of defending guilty people too, which is not what the Innocence Project does. And she's saying, hey, guilty people are impacted much more highly. And so she is very passionate about defending the guilty. And so by bringing her voice into our story, we're kind of complicating a very simplistic narrative that tends to be touted about the Innocence Project. And we're asking questions and interrogating the utility of their work versus defending the guilty. And I want you to listen also to one other thing, which is how I push this expert to be real with me. Rather than going into autopilot with a response that she's likely given countless times, I think by pushing Abby to speak to me, rather than some kind of hypothetical person at a dinner party, we get a powerful, heartfelt response from her. So this clip begins with me reminding listeners about the kinds of people Abby defends in court.
You wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about some of the people that you've represented, and you wrote this. You said, "My clients have included a young man who gunned down his neighbor in front of her 5-year-old daughter while trying to steal her car. A man who beat a young woman to death for failing to alert drug associates that police were coming. And a woman who smothered her baby for no apparent reason." And you write that these are the kinds of cases that prompt people to ask, how can you represent these people? And I'm wondering, Abby Smith, when someone comes up to you at a dinner party or other occasion and asks you that question, how can you represent these people? What do you say to them?
Every criminal defense lawyer has a Rolodex of replies to that question, and it all depends on your mood and who it is that's asking the question. Are they genuinely interested, or are they mocking you or looking for a fight?
Yeah, and I'm asking you the question, and I'm genuinely interested in hearing
in what
your reply.
I say.
I do, and not in what you say then, but I want you to answer me now. Like,
I think there's nothing more meaningful, satisfying, challenging, moving than representing a person who did something really bad and everybody's against them, and you're there to represent them, advocate for them, tell their story. And I can think of very few clients I actively, didn't like or was frightened of. Mostly I come to like all my clients, I certainly respect them. I learn a lot about them and about human beings in extremis sometimes. And I learn a lot about resilience. I represent people who have been traumatized in every possible way. And I also feel privileged to represent them because I learned something from them. They give me as much as I give them.
You know, I really appreciate the way that Abby helped me to challenge some of my own prejudices that I had and probably still have against people accused of committing serious violent crimes. And that is really one of the things I appreciate most about the work that I do, about storytelling and reporting, is that my assumptions and my prejudice are constantly being laid bare. I am always learning, and I'm always being humbled by my guests. And Freddie and I give a lot of time to thinking about what narratives or stereotypes we may be perpetuating with our own work. Our most recent episode is on Black maternal mortality and the disparate outcomes for Black moms in this country. And when I sat down to interview Stacy Stewart, she's the CEO of the March of Dimes, I realized very quickly my own deep-seated biases about race and class. In my very first question to Stacy Stewart, I assumed that Black maternal mortality is something experienced primarily by low-income women. And Freddie and I debated, along with our editor, Ruth McCambridge, about whether to keep this exchange in the final podcast that we put out. And I'm going to play this exchange first. And then, Freddie, I hope you'll talk a little bit about the discussion we had about this exchange. And this has been edited for brevity, but you can hear the full exchange on the podcast, and we'll send out those links later. But just give a listen to the very first question I asked Stacy Stewart.
I kind of want to just jump right in and talk about the fact that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes compared to white women. You know, with those kind of statistics and all the disparate outcomes that we see for Black maternal health in this country, paint a picture for me. When you picture a young Black, low-income mom going into a hospital to deliver her child or to receive prenatal care, what are her biggest challenges going to be?
Well, I think first let me just, even your question suggests that the issue is even around Black low-income women. And I know you didn't necessarily mean that, but I just in the off chance that people might be left with that impression, I want to make sure that people are clear about the disparities and why they exist. What we find is that there is no correlation between race and education or income levels. In other words, what we see based on studies is that Black women with at least a college degree or more are over 5 times more likely to die as a result of pregnancy and childbirth as compared to white counterparts.
Thank you for all that. And I appreciate you setting me straight on the very question that I asked you and the assumptions that I made within that question, which were uninformed. And the nuances that you point out are incredibly important.
Yeah, so we debated whether to keep this exchange in. On the one hand, it takes the focus off Stacy and centers the story on Amy and on her learning. And that's a problem when it happens in the media or anywhere else, because it assumes a certain audience demographic. But I thought it was also important to keep the exchange in, because I find it rare to hear a white host being corrected and responding graciously to a guest. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but I think it's often edited out for the reasons that I mentioned. It was important for us to admit that this moment had happened and how Amy's biases about race and class perpetuate white supremacy in healthcare and beyond.
Absolutely. And race is a topic that we have covered a lot on Tiny Spark in the past few years, and it's an ongoing learning journey for me as a white woman. And I've had many experiences and moments of learning throughout these past few years. About a year ago, I experienced a lot of pushback from a community of color when I said that I wanted to come and visit them and report on their community. And it made Freddie and I really think about how we frame the stories of marginalized communities writ large. Last fall, I visited the Oglala Lakota Nation in South Dakota. And as I began planning my trip, I started, as I often do when I'm planning a reporting trip, I got on the phone and I was speaking to some Lakota leaders. And they expressed a lot of skepticism about my visit. They were worried that I was searching for poverty porn. And through many conversations, I tried to assure them that was not my goal, that in fact, we were searching for stories of resiliency. And so for those of you who write about communities grappling with complex social problems, I'd like to share with you a little bit about how we went telling this story. And I want to talk about how we just opened the story, how we began it. I was reporting from one of the poorest counties in the nation. Life expectancy on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation is about 50 years old. More than 95% of the population is living below the federal poverty line. So we do cite these stats up front, but then we go immediately to a lifelong resident named Jennifer Irving. I spent a lot of time with her, and we were driving around her car on a very cold day, driving through the plains. And this is how we kind of open the story. We cite some of the stats about the community, but then we go right to Jennifer. And when you listen to her, do you hear a victim? I mean, I certainly don't. Irving talks about all this place has to offer. She's not talking about its deficits.
What you're gonna also find here is threads of resiliency. You're gonna find stories of culture and spirituality and people who would never want to leave this place. And people ask me that all the time too, like, you have a master's degree, you have all these, why aren't you working out there? Like, somehow out there is where it's at. But for me, where it's at, for my family, it's here. Do we have it hard? You bet. It's the reservation. We're pretty isolated out here, but at the same time, like, I don't want us to ever overlook the beauty of the people and the resiliency that lives here.
Jennifer's pride in this place kind of set the tone for the whole piece. We profiled many leaders who were just kind of taking care of business without the help of outsiders. And Jennifer told me that many of the younger generation were not leaving for better lives elsewhere. They were finding ways to live and thrive on the reservation. And in talking to me, and I'm actually just going to pause here from our plans because I see it's 15 minutes to the hour, Freddie, and I'm wondering if we want to just, we were going to play another clip from Jennifer Irving, but I want to make sure we have some times for questions. I'm inclined to maybe just end with Sophie Otiende. Freddie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Okay, because I just want to make sure we do get time for some questions. So I just want to kind of end again with Sophie Otiende. And she kind of, despite all of her critiques, she knows how difficult it is to tell someone's story in ways that are both dignified and ethical. And she ended our interview on a positive note. And I just want to end with Sophie here, please.
It's so easy to lose hope, to look at the different elements and to just feel very, very helpless. But I feel like if all of us just played our role, and not, like, if media told the right stories, the right way, if teachers taught the right way, if everyone just did what was expected of them, I think it would be very, very easy for us to then address this issue. And I know that sounds like living in an idealistic world, but I feel like it's actually possible to create change. It's possible to do it in a way that is effective and that no one gets hurt. But that conversation has to start. It has to start with what we are saying, that good intentions are not enough.
So, I think that's an excellent way to end, that good intentions aren't enough and they can never be an excuse. We have to keep learning. We have to stay engaged in this important work and learn from our mistakes and then do better next time. And I'm really hoping that we can continue this conversation because there's so much to discuss and explore here. I want to thank you all for joining us today. And Freddie, I just want to give you the final word before we go to questions.
Thanks. Well, I think I will again probably give it to Sophie because I noted a poem she wrote on her website, which I think seems fitting. It's titled Ally, and it reads, "Who is an ally? An ally will amplify our voice without trying to be our voice, share our story without owning our story." So we'll be sending out an email with links to Sophie's episode and all the episodes we've heard from today. And hopefully you have sent some questions in. So I'm just going to have a look and see if we got something. So a question that has been voted highest so far says, many times it's grant funders who demand testimonials, photos, evidence of impact, etc., without considering the ethical implications. Considering the power dynamic also inherent between funders and grantees, how do we as nonprofits convince funders that this practice is not okay? Amy, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a reality. Funders often drive the ship, for better or worse. And I'm keenly aware of those power dynamics that exist between all of you at nonprofits in communications work, trying to do stories ethically and feeling pressure from funders in one way or another that make you feel uncomfortable. And I've been a grantee myself. I work at a nonprofit now. And, you know, I think we have to have courage. We have to have courage on behalf of those we're working with. We have to look funders in the eye and draw the line. Tell them I can't do this story and here's why. We can't ask for these questions and here's why. And, you know, my experience with the best funders is that they'll respect you for that, you know, but I think we have to go to bat sometimes and you know, have uncomfortable conversations with funders. And I think the more we learn about ethical storytelling, the more imperative it is that we take what we know and challenge people. And I don't think that pressure from a funder can ever be an excuse to exploit somebody, to tell a story that we're not proud of, to tell a story that doesn't fully humanize somebody, but keeps them one-dimensional. You know, so that's my, and I don't say this to pretend that it's easy because it's not. It takes courage, but I think now is the moment for courage, based on everything we've heard today, based on everything Sophie Otiende has told us. I don't really see another option than that. And I don't want to simplify it. It is complex, but that's kind of my thoughts on that. Freddie, do we have another question?
Yep, someone has asked about strategies for inviting people to share stories in ways that feel meaningful for them without pressuring or exploiting. Do you have any ideas how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of a good interview, a respectful interview, is doing your homework. You know, so like with Sophie Otiende, you were aware that she had been a trafficking victim herself, and you were also aware because of the research you'd done that she didn't want to talk about that necessarily. That was not the way she identified or want to be understood. You know, I think when interviewing Tanya Culver Humphrey, we did an extraordinary amount of research before, knew her story inside and out. You know, that makes me think about what interests me. I mean, I think in terms of questions to ask is, you know, I'm always just asking myself, like I read something, I say, wow, that's interesting. I'd love to hear more about that, you know? And so I think it's about being prepared. And that shows, just being prepared itself shows a level of respect to the person. And, you know, you might not be, you might not be interviewing people who have a whole litany of, you know, literature behind them that you can research. Maybe it's some woman you've met at a shelter who you've never met before. But I think for me in those instances, and I do that frequently, sometimes if I'm out reporting, I will be interviewing people I know nothing about. And I think so much, as you can probably sense from me and some of these interviews you've been hearing today, is the manner in which we approach people. You know, sitting down, you know, I often will try to just get in a little cozy corner with somebody and just really listening intently. And I think when we're doing interviews, there can be a tendency to kind of like, maybe you have your questions in advance or you think, and I find a lot of people, especially early on with interviews, they kind of skim the surface. They have 10, 15 questions they want to ask, and they just kind of go from one to the next, one to the next. And to me, that's kind of skimming the surface. And what I like to do as a journalist, as somebody who's interviewing somebody, is I kind of see myself as kind of planting 2 feet in the ground and digging. Say, tell me more about that. And then what happened? Like using that kind of narrow focus lens and really going deep with somebody. And then what did you say? And so I'm listening, and I'm wanting to get deep. I don't then move on and like, I just find those surface level interviews are not very compelling. But I think it's really listening to somebody, showing compassion. And I think the interview will come across organically, as it would if you were talking to a friend or family member who had experienced trauma or something difficult. I approach it no differently from that. I'm compassionate, listening, and I'm asking follow-up questions. Do we have another question, Freddie?
Yes, there are a couple of questions about consent, getting consent forms, and I've lost the one that I was looking for, but also about how to interview children or how to speak to children and the consent that you need from them.
Yeah, so I mean, oftentimes, and I'm not the expert in this, but I think a lot of I think with NPR, for instance, or other national media outlets, by the very nature, for instance, like I'm doing audio interviews, I'm recording somebody, so I have a microphone out, and I ask them to introduce themselves. And so it's very obvious that I'm doing an interview and that they are consenting to being interviewed. I'm not hiding my microphone or pretending that I'm just having a conversation with them, but I'm actually going to use it in an interview. So just by the very nature of the fact that we're sitting down and you're introducing yourself to me and I'm asking you questions is consent. Of course, children are entirely different. And I feel like this is not an area where I'm an expert, and so I'm probably not going to say too much about this. But yes, you absolutely need to get some kind of consent before you're going to share the story of a minor with an audience. And I just, that feels like a little bit of a technical thing that I think that I won't comment much more on, but it's just good that you're aware of it. And yes, indeed, you need to take special precautions with children.
It says here, how do you prepare for your interviews? What do you research? Is it history on the matter? Is it your one biases? Is it past reports or articles on the matter you're reporting? What do you do to report ethically prior to arriving on site? Do you have an ethical checklist of sorts?
And just repeat the first part of the question, Freddie.
How do you prepare for your interviews? What do you research? Is it history on the matter? Is it your biases, your own biases? Is it past reports or articles on the matter you're reporting?
Yeah, I mean, all of those things. We try to do as much research as possible. And I think, especially with, I think history is really important, especially going to community like I did when I went to South Dakota. It's very important to know what the history is there. I could understand very plainly why there was a lot of skepticism to me, a white woman going into a reservation. That's very obvious. And I did try to learn more about the history there and the dynamics going on. But yeah, I mean, I think, the research is important up to a point. And then when I get to a place, and I think many of you might be visiting sites that you're, funding or that kind of thing, and you're trying to get a sense of what's going on and is this project working and how are people doing? I mean, the best thing that I can do in that case is just to be eyes wide open, listening intently. And often when you get to a place and you're either a reporter or you're representing a foundation or you're representing a nonprofit, they will trot out for you, like the beneficiaries who have been a success story, or the village elder will be brought out, and people, often powerful men, will be put in front of you to interview. And that's all good. And I'll go through those kind of machinations and formalities. But then what I love to do is say, thank you so much. I'm going to go sit and talk to those women sitting under the tree over there. Or I'm going to go talk to that mom down the street, and I choose who I want to talk to. And it's often the people who are sitting quietly in a corner, who have not been trotted out to me, who have the most to say. And those are the most compelling people to talk to. And so it's a matter of navigating spaces kind of politically, but I do those formal interviews, but I think it's so important to get out and talk to people who are being directly impacted and not just talk to people who are brought to you to kind of represent whatever place you're visiting. So that's another kind of technique I use. Freddie, do we have another question, or is there something there I didn't answer?
Can you address the issue of empathy versus sympathy? Is a shocking story of trauma endured by a client even the most effective way to create empathy, or is it actually evoking pity?
Great question. And I think it's such a fine line that I always feel that I'm walking, especially when interviewing people who have experienced trauma, is there's that very fine line between exploiting them and illuminating their story. And I think, I'm trying to think about some of the pieces that we've done. We can look at the South Dakota piece and Jennifer Irving or Tanya Culver Humphrey. I mean, both of those are stories of resilience. Tanya Culver Humphrey has done an incredible amount with her story and with her experience, and we kind of document that. And so I don't think, again, I don't think we should ever do standalone stories about somebody's trauma. I don't know what the purpose of that is. That's what we call trauma porn. It doesn't have any context. We don't know why we're hearing this person's story. We can all go find 100 people who have experienced something awful, and it's a compelling story, but it's not meaningful and it's not engaging, and we're not learning from it. I mean, Freddie and I are always trying to figure out what does this say about something larger? Who's to blame here? Why did this happen? What institution allowed this travesty to happen? Let's go talk to them. We're going to tell this person's story, and then we're going to go to them and say, all these women were sexually exploited. What did you do? Why? We interviewed somebody from UNHCR who was sexually abused in Sri Lanka. UNHCR did nothing for her, made her totally re-traumatized. We go to them, we say, what happened? So we tell her story, but then we put it in a larger context. We hold people accountable. So I think that's how you can avoid, having something that's just titillating or inappropriate or, exploitative. It always needs to be put into context. You always need to be asking yourself, why am I telling this person's story? Freddie, we might have time for one more.
One more thing. A few people have written in saying, you mentioned giving Tanya agency, that you don't give someone agency because obviously they have agency.
Yes.
So it's been brought up a few times. I just thought maybe you wanted
I appreciate that. That's a great point. I don't give somebody agency, they have it already. True, right. And so, that's a great point, and I need to think about that. And I appreciate being corrected or challenged on that. So I'm just kind of taking that in, and I don't want to just give some off-the-cuff response. I want to honor that that's a really important critique. And so thank you for all the people who raised that. I think, one thing I'm saying there, I'm sorry.
No, keep going.
It's just that I think in that interview, I just kind of want to step back a little bit and let Tanya just talk about whatever it is she wants to talk about. Let her tell her story, that it's not my story, that I'm not driving it and saying, well, what about this? And then what happened? And sometimes we do that, but I think especially at the beginning of an interview, I'm just trying to get a sense of her. I've never met this woman. She's been through so much. I just want to kind of be there with her and be gentle and just, tell me some things. And just, so, I think maybe it's when I'm saying talking about agency, I'm just trying to say that as a reporter, we can kind of come in sometimes with guns blazing and this is my interview, this is my story. No, it's not. No, it's not. This is
well, in the last minute, one last question. Oh, which I've just lost, but it was saying, are there any questions that are off limits?
No, not until somebody tells you that they are. I don't, but one thing I don't do is ever ask anybody to go into the details of what happened to them. If it's like a sexual assault, I don't ask for details around that. Doesn't matter. If that's something they want to come forward talking about, but in general, that's something I'm very careful about. And I never ask for details. Sometimes they offer it up or there's ways that it comes up, but by and large, when there's some event that has happened that is very triggering and very traumatic, I will not ask somebody to tell me the details of that actual event. So there we are at 2:00. And thank you everyone so much for joining us. We are going to be getting back to you with more of your questions, and hopefully it will inform future conversations. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much.